Okay. Looked like they were putting a sidewalk in by Burger King with the ditch.
That is going on as well.
Yeah.
So from, basically the TIF expires next May. So we have about roughly $800,000 left in the funds. We're constructing a lift station and also a sidewalk gap on the south side of Route 14.
Has it been 23 years already? Wow.
Use it or lose it.
So gentlemen, we're going to begin our meeting, and on behalf of the Village of Cary and the Board of Zoning, Planning and Appeals, I'd like to hereby call this meeting to order on this Thursday, October the 24th, 2019, at approximately 7:30 PM. And we have a full quorum of members. And so at this time, I'd like to ask our Director of Community Development, Mr. Brian Simmons, to please call the roll.
Williams?
Here.
Pippin?
Here.
Graziano?
I'm here.
O'Laughlin?
Here.
Kretschmer?
Here.
Jasper?
Here.
Corey?
Here. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, would you please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, men. So, gentlemen, it sounds like you all have your packages, and there's two approval of minutes that we need to review. So I'll just double check with all of you that you received the meeting minutes dated September the 12th for McDonald's and the meeting minutes dated September the 12th for Elm Properties. You have those?
Yes.
Yes. And before I call for a general consent and voice vote, does anyone have any questions or comments about the meeting minutes? Okay, I will seek general consent on meeting minutes dated September 12, 2019 for McDonald's Corporation. Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much, gentlemen. And then we'll seek general consent on meeting minutes September the 12th, 2019 for Elm Tree Properties. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much, gentlemen. So as you were rightly pointing to, I'm not exactly sure how we're going to refer to this meeting, but this is something that we were dealing with a few years ago. And I think that was what the ability to maybe open up establishments related to recent law. And so at this time, I'm going to ask our Director of Community Development to educate us a little bit further tonight on village case number ZPA 09001. And over to you, Mr. Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The item before you this evening is related to the state of Illinois' recent adoption of a new cannabis regulation and tax act. I'm sure this board is aware, the Illinois a few years ago adopted a medical cannabis related regulation that required villages or required municipalities to adopt the regulations to allow medical cannabis facilities within their communities. This act is for more of the recreational retail sale of cannabis. And I'll go through some background on portions of the act, but essentially this act gives municipalities the ability to either opt in or opt out of allowing the uses within their municipalities. Unlike the medical cannabis, which required us to allow it within and adopt reasonable regulations for it, this act allows municipalities to either permit it or not permit it. The village board did have some preliminary discussions on this topic the last few months and recommended that staff draft regulations for review by this board that they eventually will review and potentially adopt for regulation of uses within the municipality. But to date, no decision has been made to allow it or not allow it within the community. Brief history, this past June, Illinois adopted the subject act. Illinois became the 11th state in the United States to approve the private use of cannabis. The act legally authorizes private use and possession for adults that are 21 years and older. Municipalities, again, have the right to allow sales at dispensaries or cultivation and growing of the product within their boundaries. Currently, authorized medical cannabis regulation remains intact, consistent with what was previously approved. Under the act, the village can allow dispensaries under cultivation in the village by regulation and zoning. Some of the areas that the act would allow us to regulate would be that we can restrict it by certain zoning districts, restrict the hours of operation, regulate its proximity to other sensitive land uses such as schools, parks, or churches. We can prohibit it within residential areas. except for sole consumption by a specific resident. We can limit the number of dispensaries which are in the village, and also there's an existing condition within the act that says that a dispensing organization cannot locate within 1,500 feet of another pre-existing dispensing organization. So if the village were to allow this use to go in, that would be a restriction. If one were to locate within the town, you couldn't have another one within 1,500 feet of that location. The act further allows the creation of cannabis cafes or lounges so that individuals can consume the product. Similar to the Smoke-Free Act within the state of Illinois, you can have hookah lounges or other tobacco stores where you can smoke within the establishment, but you cannot consume the product outside of a location or the privacy of your home. Again, back in September, the village board directed staff to draft some regulations related to the regulation of this land use within the village, which is the subject for tonight's meeting. Sorry, going the wrong way. The state does provide some regulations beyond what's proposed within the text amendment this evening, which are summarized on this slide and the next slide. There are some stringent requirements for advertising or signs related to these types of businesses. So although our code may allow certain types of signs to be placed in certain locations, the state has requirements that you cannot advertise specifically towards individuals that are under 21 or would display any logo or symbol that would give the impression or relate to the cannabis leaf or a bud, so that specifically any signage that's proposed for a business would have restrictions as far as what type of language can be displayed in their signs or also within their establishment. So this slide gives some of the requirements for the advertisement of a business and what can't be done under the current state regulations. Again, the state also has requirements for the operation of a dispensary. So there's specific language within the code that would regulate how these businesses would operate, which would be above and beyond what our code would allow. So the way to look at this, similar uses that are within the village would be liquor licensing requirements, where the state has very stringent, strict requirements for liquor businesses that sell alcohol. In this case, they would be licensed through the state if they were to sell or produce cannabis, and would be subject to provisions that the state would verify or constantly monitor. Specifically, there's no delivery services allowed at any location, so this dispensary cannot bring a product to your home. Likewise, facilities cannot have drive-through uses. The operation or the business cannot operate when there's a video surveillance system. Equipment in their business isn't operative. They also cannot operate when their point of sale equipment is inoperative. So if a facility were to lose power for whatever reason, they could not sell any product in their establishment. They also would not be able to sell product when the state's electronic verification system is inoperative, and prohibited from selling when there's fewer than 2 individuals working at an establishment. There also are some requirements that when they sell a product, they need to scan a government-issued ID so that they can track who the item is being sold to, so it's they're not selling to minors or individuals under the age of 21. The proposed text amendment that you have before you for discussion this evening is looking at ways to modify our code to both review the existing provisions that we have for medical cannabis, but then to look at provisions for allowing cannabis within the future within the village. Specifically, the proposed changes to Chapter 2.6 or the land use table. Currently, medical cannabis is a conditional use within our business districts, our B1 through B3, and the M district. And then cultivation centers are conditional uses within our manufacturing district. Staff's proposal is to draft regulations that would allow dispensaries by right within the B2, B3, and the M district, would no longer allow them within the B1 district, which is the downtown district, but then would have specific use requirements within the code, which are in the next few slides, that would regulate further how those uses can be cited and screened from adjacent land uses. Other land uses or definitions that are within the state act include craft growers and infusers, along with cultivation centers. Those would be facilities that are modifying the product or growing the product. So they would be limited to manufacturing districts and would be still require conditional use within those areas.
So, Brian, can you go back really quick?
Sure.
So we're looking at cannabis dispensaries being allowed, but cultivation would be a conditional use?
Correct.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to make sure I was reading that chart right.
Yep.
Thank you.
This slide goes into the beginning of the requirements in section 3.11, which are proposed. Again, the UDO has the land use or the use provision chapters, chapter 3, which has specific regulations for different land uses. As the board may recall, when we adopted the UDO, we adopted new regulations for solar panels as far as how large they can be on a roof. That would be in this chapter. So again, this land use would be identified as a cannabis business use, would have specific requirements for those types of businesses. Specifically within the text in the staff report, every business use would be required to have a fixed location. So they would have to sell the product within a building. They could not be a food truck, if you will, that moved around different locations. They'd have to be specifically.
No push carts?
No push carts, yes. Other requirements that are proposed would be location requirements as far as where a use can be situated adjacent to other land uses. Specifically, staff is recommending for dispensaries, craft growers, and infusers that a 500-foot separation be provided to any sensitive land uses. That would include churches, schools, daycares, which are identified in this map. So if there's proposed within the business districts that are allowed, which you can see on the map are colored from the B2, B3 district, and the M district. The flags indicate a sensitive land use within the village that currently exists from a daycare, church, or a school facility. Any area that is covered by yellow would be within that 500-foot buffer and would not allow that use to go within that area. Mr. Leffler.
Yeah, just one quick question. We're doing a 500-foot buffer, but if you go back, I thought the state regulation was 1,000 feet.
Was for what?
The amount of distance from a school or church was 1,000 feet. Wasn't that under
That was
state
advertising.
That's the.
Oh, that's advertising.
That's advertising,
That's advertising.
yeah.
Okay.
However, that begs the question, how are you going to know it's a dispensary if they can't put something on the door? That's advertising.
They can't put a marijuana leaf on the sign.
No. That within itself is against the rules. You cannot advertise within 1,000 feet of a church, school, or daycare.
But you can be present within 500.
Correct.
Right,
You can
but
locate.
but the question then becomes, okay,
It's a
so how
sign.
are you going to define your business?
You can't put a
You
sign
can't
on
put
the
a sign
door.
on your
Right.
door saying that it's, if it's 500 feet.
Yeah, the requirement for the 1,000-foot separation is more for off-premise advertising. If you have a billboard along Route 14, as an example, there's the billboard next to Dunkin' Donuts. If there were a school within that area, they couldn't locate advertising within 1,000 foot.
So it's off-site advertising.
Correct. So
Okay.
the state requirements for that 1,000-foot requirement go above and beyond. This is signage for an existing business. It does reach out to print advertising or things like that. You can make things that are attractive for minors to want to frequent your establishment.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
So
There was just too many 500s and
Correct.
1000s floating
Yeah.
around there, and I just wanted clarification.
yeah, specifically within the act, the only separation requirement that exists is between two dispensaries.
Right.
So if you have an existing dispensary that gets approved, the state act requires a 1,500-foot separation to another establishment. But there is no requirement in the current act for the recreational, for separation from other land uses. That's up to
Each individual
individuals,
Okay.
villages' discretion. Previously, under the the Medical Cannabis Act, there were separation requirements for, which we're still recommending to be consistent here for the cultivation center. There's 2,500 foot separation from any residential district
Right.
example. So that act still isn't in place. It still has those requirements.
We're just
in it.
kind of mirroring that one.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
So from the analysis that, some of the discussion that we had with the village board was there was a desire to have some separation from these types of land uses so that you wouldn't have a dispensary or one of the other land uses directly next to a school or a church. So when staff analyzed it from a separation standpoint, we narrowed it down to 500 feet as kind of we thought was the more appropriate one. If you go smaller than that, it doesn't really restrict any locations. It's directly next to adjacent properties. If we doubled it to 1,000 square feet, it does take out a lot of areas where you're almost effectively restricting that use from going into the village by right. So the recommendation this evening is 500 feet, and I do have other slides that can show those other buffer area requirements as well.
And now, I guess the other question is, in the case of a recreational facility opens and somebody opens a daycare 2 doors down, is it an after the fact, or do they have to leave now?
It's whoever's in first gets the rights to be there. So if a dispensary opens first and then a daycare opens next door, the dispensary's there first. So they're legally established by that date.
Okay.
They can't locate, in a location where there already is that
Is
restriction.
that use?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Just wanted to understand.
With regard
technically
to the signage, isn't there a differentiation between advertising and identification? In other words, you could say, Joe's Weed Shop on your door, because that's identifying your business, but the advertising part of all that stuff was off premise.
Yeah, so I think from the business signage, the act, it has specific language towards other advertising you can do, so it's beyond just the signage for the business.
Oh, it was, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was advertising. I missed that at the top.
Yeah, so there's specific requirements within the act for signage as far as where it can go and how you can advertise the business.
Right, but read the complete sentence.
Yeah, so that is within 1,000 feet of school grounds, playgrounds, hospitals, healthcare facilities, recreation centers, childcare centers, public parks, public libraries, or game arcades that admit persons under the age of 21.
No, I meant the
No,
top,
No cannabis business establishment nor any person or entity shall place or maintain or cause to be placed or maintain an advertisement in any form.
any form.
But I think
Yeah.
you're making and I know what you're saying, Pat, but I think identifying your store is not necessarily the advertisement. That's the identification.
It's an advertisement.
That's a question I can still bounce off our legal department to review that again.
Yeah. I
Exactly,
mean, it's
say
good.
if it's the name of the business, if it's, I don't want to throw a name out there, but if it's, Joe's Crab Shack or something like that, is that advertising, specifically the sale of cannabis, or is it just the name of the business? So there may be an exemption for that, but
For that,
they
yeah.
wouldn't have the ability under this requirement to have any sort of images of a leaf or bud or anything like that that would indicate what they're selling there. I think the name of the business would be appropriate, but that's something we can still verify with legal as well.
Could I just comment a little bit further for Mr. Jasper? I'm looking at page number 4 of the staff report, signage. Any exterior or window signs proposed for the cannabis business shall comply with the state of Illinois requirements in Chapter 5 of this title. Signage shall not depict the actual consumption of cannabis, including an image of cannabis, leaf, or bud, or include any image designed or likely to appeal to minors.
Okay, well, is Chapter 5 the one that outlines that it has to be 1,000 feet from schools, daycares?
No, so Chapter 5 would be our sign regulations of the Village of Cary.
Right.
So the state of Illinois
Oh, this title,
requirements
okay.
would be.
Well,
yeah,
state of Illinois requirements.
Correct.
Your state of Illinois requirements is 1,000 feet.
So basically,
So does, are we,
we're looking at anybody Depending on what the
And if I-
attorney
and if I
says, you
re-
want
and
to
if I remember, more
put your site
the more
1,000 feet.
restrictive applies.
That's
whether
right.
it's state or local.
Correct.
And that's in item H, Mr. Jasper, of page 4. If the state of Illinois requires a location restriction for cannabis business use compared to the Village of Cary's requirements, the more restrictive standard shall be adhered to.
It's my understanding of the act is that the 1,000-foot requirement for the signage does not restrict the location of the business, so that a business still could locate within a certain distance of those properties, and they just may not be allowed to have any advertising or signage on their space. But it wouldn't be a restriction for them to locate within that distance unless a municipality were to adopt a regulation that had that same distance separation.
Well, I mean, we would definitely want the attorney's call on it, but I would say for sure, I mean, you don't want to tell somebody, yeah, go ahead within 500 feet, but you can't even put the name of your business on the door because of what you do.
Correct.
That'd make it even more shadier.
Yeah, that's it. Knock on the door 3 times. And
Well,
yeah.
the other side of that, you said you had this graphic defined at other footages as well. Just kind of guesstimating this, it doesn't really, 1,000 feet doesn't really change much where it's available.
Nope, there's your 1,000-foot buffer.
Right.
Yeah. No, it doesn't change it much.
Yeah, it does, I mean, from a location standpoint, the main restriction that we have, that's in the code is if one of these businesses were to locate within the village, if you were to get a dispensary located somewhere, that 1,500-foot separation, if it were to locate on the west end of town and any of the commercial districts, would effectively wipe out another one from being able to locate in that area. And likewise, if one were to locate on the east side of town, if you're basically taking, the bubble around the Goddard Day
Right.
School, you're at another 500 feet to the outside of that, that size of a ring, putting somewhere else in the village, it would knock out those 2 potential zones where something could locate at. And from my understanding of talking to, we'll say from village perspective, we have received a number of calls of people that are looking at, what the village will be doing from this perspective, prospective businesses, what their desire would be, and most of them are looking more for a retail type location as opposed to an industrial location because they want more of that traffic, in
Right.
front of them. But the ones that have been cited in other communities for medical cannabis, they're a mixture of locations. They're both industrial and commercial zones, but most of them have been located more in a retail type area.
Brian, what did staff base the 500-foot buffer on when putting this together?
The 500-foot separation was somewhat through discussion with our board, where at the committee of the whole level, we were reviewing potential separation requirements. The board wanted to see some restrictions, but didn't give a specific number, so we looked at both the 250, 500, and 1,000 foot buffer. It was more, the 500 foot was solidified just from it a significant distance away from a property where you potentially have those uses. So staff was comfortable with that level, just from a standpoint that there are, that doesn't limit you to 2 or 3 commercial properties in the village that potentially could accommodate a mix, like the Cary Square Shopping Center or Westlake Center in this example would be permitted locations. But if the landlords for those properties may not allow the use, and then if they don't allow it, then you're effectively restricting it from going in if you have a larger separation requirement.
And any idea what other communities have done that have already addressed this? I remember reading recently about one that set a 750-foot buffer.
I read about one
Did staff
2
look
days
in?
ago that's going to deny it completely.
Yeah, so
Yeah, there's-
DuPage County, I think, denied it in any unincorporated areas. So
Yeah, so there's a number of communities that have already started to respond to this. It was actually, if you can imagine, it's a lot of individuals in my roles are having some unique discussions with other municipalities, trying to figure out what their communities are going to be doing. I've talked to other local communities around here that directly border us to the west of McHenry County, and their separation requirements are similar to the 500 feet that we're proposing. Some of them were less than that. But there are communities that have opted out not to allow it entirely. And the issue from a code perspective, when you're drafting language too, is if we establish a separation requirement from a land use, you have to, with this time, image shows you where those could go. But if you significantly increase that where it makes it impossible or almost impossible for that use to locate within your community, you're effectively restricting it from coming into the community. And that would set the village up from a legal standpoint. It would be hard to defend that as a regulation if we said, I'm just throwing a number out there, 2,500 feet would eliminate all the commercial zones that you're drafting regulations that would allow it, but those regulations don't allow it by how it's drafted, be permitted. So effectively you're restricting it, that could open us up from a litigation standpoint.
I guess from a committee of the whole standpoint, that in talking about this, obviously you don't have a roll call yet or anything like that, but
Right.
we've come to this point, or is it to do all this work and then to have them vote no is
It's a significant line item revenue
Yeah.
in the budget. There's not going to be one person on there that doesn't want something.
Okay.
Now, I'll say what we looked at from the buffer standpoint is, we focused in on land uses that would generally have, young kids at them, so schools, daycares, churches, those types of land uses. We did look at providing buffers around parks as well. But with the location of all of our commercial districts and where the parks are located at, it wiped out the area. So we did drop that out of that buffer requirement because it would be nearly impossible to decide a use if we were to put a buffer around the park.
It's still against state law to smoke in the open anyway.
Correct. Right. But, but there are, if you were to not allow those two land uses next to each other, if you're looking at,
But
it would eliminate pretty much every commercial zoning because you have JC Park that's right in the middle of, basically by Cary Square Shopping Center, would wipe out that whole corridor area. And you have parks that are, directly adjacent to other commercial corridors that it would effectively eliminate the ability to have a use in the town.
And on this map, you still have Maplewood School as a school, correct?
No, we don't have Maplewood marked
okay.
because it's not operating as a school.
Yeah, no,
presently.
I couldn't tell
Yeah.
by the circles where I was looking.
Yeah, so the two that are identified here, that's the KinderCare daycare. And then this is the church on Ada Street.
Yes, okay.
And then you have the Baptist church downtown, where those circles, but Maplewood is in this location.
In that
now.
location, okay,
Right.
gotcha.
If your buffer were to be provided around that, it would just come out a little bit more into
Of this,
this
yeah,
area.
yeah.
So, but effectively KinderCare is the same.
Circle,
Circle,
basically,
yeah.
yes. Now, this is the one, there's your 500 foot.
Yeah,
Okay.
so this is from 1,000 feet to 500 feet. So this is the proposed recommendation. So there's a couple areas that allow more, which would be along Carroll-Algonquin Road by the Trout Valley entrance. You have some areas along Three Oaks Road as well, or on the Goddard School that would be, it would allow more land area to potentially have that, but most of those properties are undeveloped currently. And then with the
KinderCare opens
KinderCare
more
as well,
along the
yeah.
14 corridor.
Yeah, and as you can see with the downtown area, without, although the church is located in the south of downtown, without having the district being allowed, when you go up to 1,000 feet, it does take out some other properties that are along 14 and First Street, which is the existing bank building, which is empty at this point. Good. So continuing on again, the separation for two dispensaries will be the 1,500 feet. That's per the state's requirements. Staff is also recommending a similar separation between if a craft grower were to locate within the community or a cultivation center, they can have two of those uses again within 1,500 feet. Those will be limited to our manufacturing districts or anything that's shown in purple. but would keep a similar separation so you wouldn't have multiple of those uses next to each other. And finally, the cultivation center, the 2,500 feet is consistent with the Medical Cannabis Act that has that separation requirement from the specific land uses for schools and parks, or schools and churches again, but also restricts those uses from being next to residential properties. I want to clarify that is a state requirement for those facilities based on how the village has developed. We analyzed it that 2,500 feet would actually not allow the use anywhere in town. So a cultivation center under the act would not be permissible within the village, and this proposal is consistent with the act's requirements. Any other questions on the separation
Well, can
requirements?
you comment on that further, Mr. Simmons? Then you're saying that based upon the map and the cultivation center, that you couldn't do anything like that in town. I have a specific recollection about that from our previous meeting several years ago.
So
Do we run into a legal issue there because we don't allow it? I mean,
no,
it's-
because the state requires, it's a good question. The state, the Medical Cannabis Act requires us to adopt regulations to allow those uses. So it's similar to I'm drawing a blank on it. There's certain land uses that we have to provide regulations for, like cell towers, and other similar type land uses. The state adopts within their regulations a requirement that these uses cannot be within a certain distance of another land use. So in the state act, it has a 2,500 foot requirement within that act. So by their adopting the regulation, we're just following the requirement as well. We're adopting that as part of our code, but just by how the village has developed for the 2,500 foot separation, there is no area in the village that currently fits that definition. So we're not, although we're drafting a regulation that mirrors the state requirement, by doing that, it's the state requirement kind of trumps our code.
Yeah, you always got to go to the higher level.
Correct.
The state level says you can't do it. We're creating the conditional use for it, but there's nowhere that you can do it according to state law.
Correct.
Gotcha.
But from the recreational side of it, for the dispensaries, is the state has no separation requirement that they built into their code. So we don't have to adopt a regulation for separation. We can allow them by right, and there's no separation requirement. It could be 1 foot if we wanted to do something like that. But if we adopted that similar requirement of 2,500 feet and it couldn't be next to a residential area, then you wouldn't be able to do something in town for a dispensary. And since the state doesn't have that requirement, if we were to adopt something that would effectively restrict it, that would open us up to legal issues.
So can I continue down that line of thinking just for a second? And forgive me, gentlemen, but you were talking about the table of permitted uses, and you referenced earlier the idea of a hookah lounge, and I'll use Westlake as the example. Someone decides to come to the town, request a permit for a hookah lounge next month, and they get it. Then they could subsequently come back, assuming this all gets formalized, and request some type of cannabis use?
So from the state act, the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, it restricts smoking within establishments. So you can't smoke within a public place. Restaurants, bars, retail establishments, business establishments, you can no longer smoke in those establishments. That act provides provisions that you can have businesses that are solely for smoking. So a hookah lounge or a tobacco shop are permitted to have smoking within the establishment because their sole purpose is for smoking. This act for recreational cannabis does have a provision to allow for consumption at businesses similar to that. It wouldn't be a hookah lounge per se, but you could have a business that would be permitted under the state requirements to allow for the consumption, either smoking or edible components to allow for somebody to consume a product at a business establishment. What staff is recommending is that we would not allow any consumption in the village at these establishments. So that would be a restriction in section
Yeah, that was.
11. So it can be sold at retail and approved dispensary, but you could not be consumed on the premises. So there would be only sales or production in town, but there would be no approved consumption at one of those businesses.
All right, so I know I'm jumping ahead, Mr. Simmons, but this is going to be kind of where I think the rubber hits the road. So pick any establishment that we're familiar with in the community, and someone comes in and requests to sell cannabis, and they're approved. Can a restaurant request it?
No.
They cannot.
No. So from a operation standpoint, the sole operation of the business is the retail sale of cannabis. So you cannot have a business that has alcohol, and this is per the state requirements. You can't have, both the sale of cannabis and alcohol in an establishment, or the sale of cannabis and other retail products at that establishment. It's the sole sale of cannabis products at that facility.
So if you were a smoke shop and you chose to make a request to the community to say, I'd like to sell this cannabis,
It couldn't be a smoke shop anymore.
could or could
So
not?
you
Could
couldn't
not be.
sell tobacco anymore, you could
Correct.
only sell, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, it's not like
Sure.
You can't
CBD
cross,
oil.
you
It's
can't
different.
cross, yeah, you can't cross the two together. It's cannabis only, and everything else is separate.
So maybe that's the question, gentlemen. So just so I'm clear on this, give me an example where you think someone could come to the town, to the ZPA, and make the request. What kind of establishment would we be looking at?
Well,
A smoke
if I-
shop.
if I may jump in
absolutely.
there, first off, if we pass the permitted uses, they don't have to come to us.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get my head
And,
around.
and since we pretty much blocked everybody out from cultivation because of the
State.
state guidelines.
Right.
So at this point in time, with the way that this is currently proposed, we have no input into how those businesses come in to operate within the community.
I'm just trying to understand that it's a year from now, this gets resolved. Some business wants to come to the community and sell cannabis. I'm trying to understand how they would make the request and whether or not they'd be able to open, assuming they fit the criteria that
Sure.
we're establishing.
Yeah, so as Mr. Jasper mentioned, from a dispensary standpoint, so if it's a retail sales standpoint, they could, under the drafted regulations, they could find a land or a space that's zoned for B2 or B3 or the M district. If they were to sign a lease for that location, they would come to the village for the application. They would need to conform to the requirements that are spelled out here. So there's still screening requirements and operation requirements that they would need to have, but they would be considered a permitted use. So it would just be a occupancy application with the village, going through the building permit process for any sort of improvements to the space, and then ensuring that they comply with these regulations. They would be able to open and operate at that facility, provided that they meet all the other separation requirements.
Thank you.
What about infused products?
So in infused products, there's, under the Act, there are different definitions for business uses, specific business types, which staff is proposing in paragraph 12, those definitions. So generally identifying what a cannabis business use is. There's a dispensary, which is the type of facility that would sell, retail the products. A craft grower would be a smaller establishment that would be allowed to grow the products, but would not be a full cultivation center. But then infusers would be a facility that could take that product and turn it into another product, whether it be an edible or.
Yeah, I understand that, but my question is the product itself. We had a little bakery over there in the Kerry Square, and over in this rack, they got bakery goods. Over in this rack, they have cannabis-infused bakery goods.
Yeah, so they would not be able to do, again, the business, if that would be selling as a dispensary, could only sell cannabis products. They couldn't be mixed with another land use.
So even infused products have to go through a dispensary.
Correct. So under the definition, it would include the selling of dispensing cannabis or related products. So any product that is infused with cannabis, if it's an edible or some sort of product from that perspective, it can only be sold at a dispensary, and they can only acquire it from a craft grower or infuser type establishment.
So basically any-
So Pilates can't serve it as a dessert.
Correct. No, so
Brownies? Yeah.
under the current act, I mean, things can change in a few years, but yeah, currently, it's essentially, if you want to buy, it's not like you can go to a tobacco store and you buy tobacco, but then Juul also has tobacco products. It's specifically, you can go to this location to get cannabis. You can't purchase it in another location, or they can't sell products. There's very strict restrictions as far as how the business can operate under the state requirements. That they have the number of employees, it has to be monitored, basically 24/7. And they are going to be inspecting them constantly from a regulatory standpoint. But you can't have two uses, commingled, so a restaurant could not, suddenly start providing that use as well.
So basically, just to sum that up, so I'm clear, any product that contains THC, no matter what form it's in, can only be sold from a business that sells nothing else but that.
Correct.
Gotcha, okay.
The other, just to go through the rest of the use requirements that staff is proposing, again, under the act, there is restrictions on residential locations, so staff is recommending that within town, you cannot have cannabis business use within a residential district. So that would be no home occupation could be allowed to have the use, or within a mixed-use building. So if we were to have a commercial building downtown or in another portion of the town that had retail on the first level and residential above, you could not have cannabis business use if there's residential on that property. There also need to be provide adequate lighting on the property, both exterior and interior of the space, for safety purposes, to ensure that the levels are at an appropriate level for any security cameras to see the property, access and visibility from a public street so that the establishment can be seen from the adjacent roadway. Again, signage complying with village and state code requirements. Hours of operation, staff is proposing 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. State does allow at 6 a.m., but staff had recommended start at 8 a.m. Based off some feedback from the village board. The staffing still requirement, that's the state requirement for 2 employees minimum. Sales can only be performed within a building, and specifically a dispensary. Again, we're proposing that there be no consumption allowed within the village at these establishments. It would be at a private home or another community that may allow consumption. And then a production of the products can only be performed at a craft grower, infuser, or cultivation center, which would only be allowed as conditional uses within industrial districts. So those uses would have to still go through a zoning process to get approval, but a dispensary would be permitted within all of the districts.
So 2 questions on this slide, Brian. One is, do we want to define mixed-use building better? Or is that automatically, we're just assuming that that means store below, house above?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the mall, if it went into the Juul Mall, that's a mixed-use building. You got the Juul and the smoke shop and the this and the karate store and,
Sure.
I mean,
Those are retail
retail.
operations.
Yeah, from the,
but
how
it
it's
says
drafted,
no
how-
home occupation or mixed-use building.
so how it's drafted in the code as recommended, it doesn't exactly mirror what I put on the slide, but reading paragraph 3, it shall be unlawful to operate a cannabis business use within a residential zone district in a building which contains a residence. So if there's a building that's mixed use, vertical, and has a residence within it, that would not be allowed. Or within a mixed use development that includes a residence.
Okay, missed that, thank you. And then I guess my only other question, I saw, it was on the news the other night, they were in, actually, Colorado, so I know the regs are different, but the distribution, and I don't know how the Illinois law reads yet, but at the distribution retail store, whatever you want to call it, they were selling actual little cannabis plants. Would they be able to do that, or is that considered a craft grower then? How?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Under the act does allow a resident to grow within their own home, I believe up to 5 plants for medical use. So an individual could potentially purchase it and grow their own cannabis at their home if it's for medicinal purposes. The Act does not allow it for recreational use.
So these stores wouldn't be allowed to have.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's I'm not sure exactly how that would be operated. You know, it's beyond our reach from a zoning perspective.
No, I understand. I just, it was a question because I saw something and I didn't know. I know you're way deeper in this law than I am, so.
Fortunately, this is not something I ever thought I would be discussing in my 20 years career.
Understand.
So yeah, I think whether they can sell plants or not, that's something that's under the state requirements, whether they can do that or not. But I know the Act does allow for a homeowner, if they're doing it for medicinal purposes, that they can grow their own, and they're limited to 5 plants under the Act.
Thank you.
So it kind of concludes what I have presented prepared for this evening. So essentially, as the board's aware, any proposed modifications have to meet text amendment standards similar to other standards that we have for other zoning conditions, and basically that the proposed amendment has to be not detrimental to the orderly development of the village, so it's not impedes a development of the community. It should not be detrimental to the public health, general welfare, and community of the village, or the amendment promotes the public interest, not solely the interest of the applicant. So the way we drafted the regulations is intended to not specifically restrict location by outright, but still allow it, would have limited certain requirements as far as where the use can be sited and operated. Essentially, the Act from the state gives us the ability to regulate the time, place, and manner of the business, so we can't regulate specifically the operation or the content that the business is doing, but we can say where they can go, when they can operate, and certain requirements related to that. Similar to sign regulations have the same authority that we can just regulate in time, place, and manner. We can't regulate the content. But the Act, the proposed regulations would be applicable to the entire village. It would not specifically, provide requirements for a specific property within the village. So staff believes that the proposed requirements proposed this evening would comply with the standards. So happy to hear any additional feedback you may have from the board's perspective, but if the CPA is in agreement with the proposed language, staff would recommend that the board approve a text amendment, or recommend approval of a text amendment to the Village of Cary Unified Development Ordinance for the regulation of cannabis business uses as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. I know that's a challenging task for our community, so thank you very, very much. So gentlemen, additional questions for Mr. Simmons?
Yes.
Mr. Jasper?
First off, I have nothing else on the zoning districts. I think we've covered that, and I don't think there's a difference between 1,000 and 500 and whatever, so.
No.
However, if we move to the third portion, which is the definitions, in italic, or in,
There it is. Okay.
you've got the what do you call it? Can't think of what I'm talking about. Anyway, cannabis business, dispensary, craft grower. Are those defined somewhere else in more detail at the
Yes.
state level?
Yeah, so these are essentially copied from the state act. So there's more specific descriptions of those types of businesses in the act. But this just mirrors those definitions as well. So this captures the essence of those definitions, but there are other regulations specific to those types of businesses.
At the state level, craft grower, infuser, do their operations allow for intrastate sales?
I believe it does not.
No,
I think it's
yeah.
only within the state of Illinois.
Yeah, I thought that was, it was just in interstate. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And there's no retail sales whatsoever at either of those operations,
Correct.
okay? like I said, this is a big opportunity, I think, for revenue growth. I mean, we've all sat and listened to the city of Chicago and everything that they've done related to this, and, you know, even within Cary, it could potentially be a substantial line item on the asset side of any kind of balance sheet or anything. So I can understand, you know, the desire to get this ready and to be in place. However, you know, this is still operating, number one. You know, it's relatively new and unknown. You know, we've got 10 other states that are doing it 10 different ways. We have the federal government, who's taken very little action to move towards any kind of change within their regulations of cannabis, so we would be operating at odds within federal statutes. And one of the big things within that is it essentially makes this a cash business. Has there been any conversation with the chief of police and his knowledge or his conversations with other chiefs of police or other law enforcement agencies around the country as to what kind of issues these dispensaries of, you know, are we potentially bringing in additional crimes of robbery and you know, additional weapons and those kind of things.
I will say the chief has had discussions with other communities. Obviously, there are some concerns from a law enforcement standpoint as far as how to not only regulate or deal with potential issues that may revolve around the type of business it is and how it is allowed to operate, but also from a enforcement standpoint of individuals that may be under the influence of the product, you know, driving vehicles or other stuff like that. Those are, you know, high-level issues, obviously, that, you know, go beyond the land use regulations.
Right.
But certainly, there have been concerns from the law enforcement, you know, side of things as far as how those aspects will be, you know, continually monitored. The issue is, you know, from the state perspective, is that it is going into law. It is going to be something that's effective January 1st. So whether we allow it or not, the state allows it. It's something that is here and it'll be here for a while until the feds may come in and say no, or they may adopt their own regulations and allow it by right everywhere. So there is the, you know, concerns from that standpoint. The chief is aware of it, and that's, you know, been discussed at the village board level as well, as far as, you know, what, you know, potential concerns there would be. You know, if it's adopted, whether it's adopted in the village or not, it's still something that they have to respond to, you know, those types of issues, and that some of the act funds that it will produce at the state level will come back to local municipalities for enforcement efforts, and, you know, is earmarked for, you know, police departments for, you know, kind of, you know, monitoring or enforcing efforts within the state. So some of that money will be coming back to the municipalities for the administration of the act. And then there are components of it, as Mr. Jasper alluded to as well, from a revenue standpoint. The village has not determined exactly, you know, what our policy would be if we do adopt it. The state does allow, or the state allows under the act municipalities to tax, or a local tax of 3% on any product that is sold. It's the maximum that we can charge for that. So that's in addition to our local tax, sales tax. So under your sales tax, currently now, if it's, say it's 9%, you know, 1% comes back to the village. The rest of the percentage goes to the state or other, you know, taxing bodies. For cannabis-related business uses, there would be an additional 3% on top of that 1% that we would get back, so that if a business were to come in here, potentially could be a larger, you know, revenue source back to the village. But that's not detailed in the requirements here, but that's a potential revenue source the village could have. Mm-hmm. It's all dependent on the market too. If, you know, if somebody, we could allow it, and, you know, the business could say that it's not, our municipality is not a prime location for it, And you can have regulations for it, and you can never have the business located.
Can you provide a little background on why you have made dispensaries an allowable business in all 3 business districts?
Sure. We had discussions on it from a use perspective. Essentially, by drafting the regulations that you have before you for the standard requirements, it's the way I've looked at the cannabis, medical cannabis facilities in the past is they're very highly regulated. So like a medical facility operates very similar to a pharmacy. That it's restricted as far as who has access to the product, where it can be sold. If you were to go in the Walgreens, as an example, you can't get to the area where they have, prescription medications in there. This type of business would be very similar to that. It's very highly regulated from the state's perspective as far as who has access to the product, how it's sold, how it's monitored from that perspective. So by looking at it, we considered it was very similar to another retail operation. Aside from screening it from adjacent land uses, there did not see a strong need for it to have to go through a zoning process for every single time a land use were to come in. If it's something that the village wants to allow within the community, even from a conditional use standpoint, it's already a use that we're saying is appropriate for that district. So a conditional use or permitted use says that this district is appropriate for it, and then we're establishing requirements as far as where that use can go. With these regulations, we're effectively laying out, this is the roadmap for where this land use can go, and they have to comply with that, and if they don't, then it's not allowed.
Mr. Jasper, could I continue your line of thinking for a moment?
Sure, I can come back.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I was thinking about earlier, Mr. Simmons, is when you said you never thought in your career you'd find yourself going down this path. And I know you have a lot of contacts in and around the area with your peers. And based upon those discussions, does this look similar, different, parallel?
It's similar to what other communities have been adopting. So I will say, I've talked to other municipalities that have been adopting regulations. I've bulked up ours more than some other communities have done. They're closer to the city that have adopted regulations, because I think there are some areas that I wanted to see stronger language within it to provide more clarity. And I think what we're drafting here it's similar to what other communities have done. It's mainly the look at the use. It's from a security standpoint, making sure that it's adequately lighted so that if somebody's going to the business that wants to shop there, they want to go to a facility that they feel safe at. So most of the retail operators that I've spoken to, that's their concern as well, is that they want to go to a center where there's people. They don't want to be tucked away in an industrial park that they're dark and dingy and that has a negative connotation about the place, but also from a safety standpoint for their employees and for individuals that may be going to the establishment, they want to be in a location that has adequate lighting, has other businesses around it that may have more people, so there's more, it doesn't make it as attractive, as a target, if you will, for somebody that may want to do something bad with the business.
And that's always been my concern about putting a dispensary, or when we had the former laws of the medical dispensaries being in the M district. It's quiet, it's tucked away. There's no level of security that you have in a larger, well-lit shopping area.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
I think I understand your concerns, Mr. Jasper, but I at the same token, I think you're looking at a better security if you are out in the open as opposed to hidden away.
And the hours of operation would also regulate that as well. So with the 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. is your main commercial time period that shopping centers or those businesses would be open. Industrial parks, you do have different shifts, but you don't have people outside.
Right.
So we still would allow it within those districts, but more than likely a business would not desire to be in that location for those types of purposes. But still would be a use that we would consider appropriate for those areas. And it might be more in a fringe area as opposed to a large industrial building, where we do have some buildings that have multiple tenants within them. But I don't see a large warehouse building being suddenly converted to a dispensary.
And just one last one, Mr. Jasper, and I'll turn it right back to you. So with regard to your communications with other communities, Mr. Simmons, has anyone memorialized this into their code at this point, or are they in the process of where we are at the moment?
Yeah, there, a few communities have adopted regulations. So it's, the state passed the act this summer. It goes into effect January 1st. So a number of communities are going through the public hearing process right now as we are. But most of them, Crystal Lake, as an example, they just had a hearing recently, and they were allowing it commercial districts similar to our requirements. I believe Algonquin is in a similar path or boat, but there are other communities that are further down in towards the city that are along the railroad line that have adopted our regulations.
Thank you.
So it's I joke about it from my career standpoint. It's just, we never thought you'd be talking about this type of topic, allowing it, but it is here, and you have to respond to it from that perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Jasper, for your flexibility.
We go down to the bottom line, all of the personal service-oriented uses. We're talking about massage parlors, tattoo parlors, vaping operations, well, I guess tattoo parlors
It's already above, yeah.
are already above. But those are included within those, right?
So a vaping establishment would be a tobacco store, so it's not a service type use. That's in a different section of the code.
Okay.
But that would be, tobacco shops are generally permitted within our zoning district, so that's how we've classified those types of land uses.
Okay.
The other personal service would be something that's not identified here or very similar to something here, so.
And this
that's
is
kind of
only
like-
a small
Correct.
portion of the code, yeah.
Correct, and this is just the small services section of the table. But it's kind of your catch-all for other types that we may not,
Right.
be looking at.
But just as a comparison, we would find then we are stating within our UDO that we find tattoo parlors to be operations that need to be much more limited and much more controlled than a cannabis dispensary.
Correct, based on these regulations, yes.
Based on our former chairman also.
Based on what?
Our former chairman.
Yeah, we know, you know what, that's one we did not look at when we redid the UDO. We should have.
It was discussed, we did have individual here that had, comments regarding tattoo parlors and potentially allowing them in other districts, but the will of the board was to keep it as
Okay.
status quo.
So how set, and I'll close and let other people ask questions. How set are you on these being permitted uses in the dispensary being permitted uses in B2, B3, and M? My concern is that, again, as I started off this, is that there are a lot of unknowns here. And by not making these operations come before the village, either at this level or at the village board level, or, to define their operations for us, to give us a little bit of background of where they're coming from. How do we control what we do know?
What conditions would you propose?
I'd make it conditional use.
I understand that, but what conditions would you add on?
Well, I would be concerned about, depending on where they're at, the hours of operation. I would be concerned about the way in which they are handling money. I would be concerned about their own background and ability to run this business.
Isn't that what our staff is doing when they issue a
Well,
license?
if this was something, going back to detached garages where we were going to run into thousands of them, over a period of time, but we're talking, at most 4 or 5 opportunities on this throughout time. And I'm just saying there are too many unknowns about what's going on in this business, and as we move forward, as we hit January 1, as we hit through the first year, as we hit into the third year, we're going to know more about what these operations are going, and we're going to know more about how we may want to manage our zoning. Today, we don't know what we don't know. And I think by making it a permitted use, I think we're setting ourselves up for potential surprises. There may be nothing. There may be absolutely nothing. But I'm just saying that there are, a lot of unknowns out there.
Anything else, Mr. Jesper?
I'm done talking.
Thank you for your comments, I appreciate it. Gentlemen, other comments?
Well, I'd just like to compliment the staff on the job they did in researching this, putting this together. I'm very comfortable with the direction they've taken this, being in alignment with other area communities that have gone down this road ahead of us or are in a similar situation, and how it dovetails with the state regulations. And I do like the fact that Mr. Simmons added some more definitive, stronger language in the Village of Cary's regulation for cannabis. And I'm pretty comfortable with the way it's set forth here by the staff. It's just my
Thanks very much,
comment.
Mr. Pipkin. I would concur with that assessment. I too believe that the staff has the wherewithal to make good conscious decisions on behalf of the community. Anyone else, gentlemen?
No, just, we probably went through this 3 years ago
Yes.
or whatever it was. And my only question is, why would we not consider cannabis cultivation, craft grower, and infusers in the A1 district?
We don't have an A1 district anymore.
It's right there. It says A1, you know.
You want to show me where that is?
I don't know.
Okay, thank you. The last A1 district got turned into a park, as I recall. No, and I want to also agree with Mr. Pippin. I think that staff's done a really good job of putting this together, putting some extras to it. I will say this from not personal experience, but a family member who works or worked for a medical cannabis dispensary as a security guard, former police officer. And, the crime in that area was no more. They hired 2 people. One of them was a security guard who was a former cop because they didn't want those kind of issues. And that's what a lot of these places look at. I will agree that with the concerns of the police, and I've seen a number of things lately that have shown that the biggest issue is how to determine whether somebody is DUI on cannabis or not. But that's a problem whether they're buying it here or buying it in Crystal Lake or buying it in Fox River Grove and driving through. We're going to have that issue no matter what, once it does become legalized. So that's above where we're looking at the zoning portion at that point, but it is something that I know all police departments are concerned with, and I do hear it's coming. They're figuring out a way to do it, so I don't know what that is going to entail, but.
So we might as well be prepared to get our piece of the pie.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, just because we can doesn't mean we should, but in this case, when there's a first to market sort of opportunity, and, you have to weigh the good and the bad, because you're only gonna have one chance to be at first to market. At least we're being proactive as a village to be there, whether we're more restrictive, which is good, but at least to have the opportunity, because, again, like Pat said, we don't know we don't know what we don't know yet, but at the same time, startups and all different sorts of things happen, and if someone didn't take a risk or kind of try to regulate it and do it right the first time. So kudos to staff, and we'll see where it goes from here.
And I will say too, just to verify too, that the board has not taken formal action on this at all yet. We've had discussions at the board level, and the board directed staff to draft regulations based off some of the discussions that we have had, but there has been no formal vote by the board to approve it or not. So we may still recommend this, they may get to the board level and they may say, no, we don't want to do it at all.
Right.
You know, there might be political pressure against that. Or they may say, yeah, we concur, we're going to allow it.
Well, and I think that's what we're looking at is it zonable? The decision on whether the city wants it or not is the elected officials. We're the ones that are going, is it zonable?
Yeah, and if there's any, changes that you want proposed to the language, I'm happy to discuss those as well. But if the board is to recommend approval or make a recommendation based on what's drafted, we can go forward from there, but be happy to still
Yeah,
respond.
thank you, Mr. Simmons. And gentlemen, as part of the process, I just want to make sure that we're following our normal protocol. This is the time where we would normally ask those in the audience to speak. And I think it's important to state for the record that there is no one in the audience tonight to have any feedback about this particular request. So we'll close the public portion. And before the chair calls the motion, are there additional questions that you would like to contemplate?
I lied. Just at the bottom of the page, recommending deleting existing definitions in Chapter 11 related to medical cannabis. Is that part of your,
Yes, so it's at the bottom of page 5
Yeah.
of the staff
page
report.
5?
Yep.
Correct.
Sure.
All the lined out stuff.
Yeah, because it's now just a cultivation
Oh, okay.
center, not a
Yep.
medical cultivation.
Yeah, so it's,
Yep.
yeah, so
Okay.
it's just, the definitions are
Very
now
good.
pulled in chapter 3 as opposed to chapter 11.
I was sitting here and I just read that, but I did read that as well.
Sure.
So gentlemen, any additional comments? Okay, so the chair will entertain a motion to recommend to the Village Board of Trustees approval of the text amendments to the Village Cary Unified Development Ordinance for the regulation of cannabis business uses.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Before we call the vote, any additional comments or questions? All right, Mr. Simmons, would you please call the roll?
Kretschmer,
Yes.
Jasper,
Based off of Chapter 3 use provisions only, I vote no.
Williams,
Yes.
Pippin,
Yes.
Graziano,
Yes.
O'Laughlin,
Yes.
Corey.
Yes. So, Mr. Simmons, I think because this is new for all of us here, if you would be kind enough to just reinforce some of the comments that were made, particularly around who has access to this, that would be appreciated on behalf of the CPA.
Yeah.
But again, I want to extend my thanks to you. I recognize this is really out of the norm for staff. So thank you for educating us and making sure that you talk to the other corresponding communities. I think we got to the right place, and we'll let our elected officials take it from there. Before we close, I just want to double check with yourself regarding future meetings and what they may look like.
Yeah, so I do have another item for discussion for other business for future meeting schedule for next year,
Yes.
briefly. But as far as upcoming meetings, we will have a meeting, the first meeting in November, so our next meeting. I have two petitions, one's from the village as well regarding a well house. The second is regarding the Selkie property on the east side of town. So that'll be November 14th.
Thank you.
So 3 weeks from this evening. So we'll have two cases for discussion that night. And then the other item I had on here just for discussion purposes is we're setting our schedule for meetings for next year, both village board and ZPA meetings. I know previously we've had some discussions at the level as far as do we want to still have 2 meetings a month or go down to 1 a month? Also, is Thursday still the most appropriate evening for it? Just throwing it out there from a discussion standpoint. The code specifically states that meetings shall be held at the chairman's discretion. So, we've typically adopted a schedule that has a date within it, so there's some flexibility. It's not specifically in the code. There's no text amendment required to determine a different date if we want to change the date of a meeting. But if there's ability to keep it on Thursdays, if we want to go to 1 a month, or if there's another day of the month that we want to explore as well, those can be options just thrown out there for discussion to see if there's any changes I want to
I
make.
keep an open mind about this, but I would say that it's been my experience, and there's a number of you here that have been longer than me, that we seem to have been reducing the meetings. And I think the UDO is starting to do what we
I
want
think
to
once the
do.
UDO seriously kicks in, we're going to be looking at one a month
At best,
at best, yeah.
yeah.
Well, my question would be to you, can you get the business that your department needs to get done if we go to one meeting a month?
Well, we also have a problem of, we run into a situation where we have in the past, where we've, sent a petitioner back to revise their petition to reconsider something that, came up out of the discussions and such.
Good point.
And if we,
Prolong
move
it.
to once a month, I think it's probably easier to continue on a bi-monthly or, twice a month schedule.
And just cancel
And
what we don't-
cancel.
Yeah.
Well, can I
when it's
comment
not
on that, though?
appropriate.
Because for those of us, all of us, that working other jobs, planning schedules is critical.
Well, how about if we look at it this way? What if we take and pick one as our primary
Yes.
and keep the second, as on an as-needed basis, so that we can set our schedules to make sure that we're around for that primary meeting?
Right.
And then if something pops up, then, we have to adjust our schedules if we can. If we can't, we'll go on with the.
We look at, we stay with the second and fourth Thursdays, the first, second Thursday being the primary and the fourth being the secondary.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, if you focus on, say, the second Thursday as an example, if we did need to continue a meeting for whatever reason, it doesn't have to be continued to another Thursday.
That's
We
right.
can continue it to any
Any
date
day.
certain.
That's true too.
So if we needed to have a Saturday, meeting, not that I would recommend that, but if we needed to have that, there would be the ability to continue it to another date, from that perspective. It doesn't have to specifically be a date that we've already established for a meeting.
Yeah.
And to Ms. Cribb's question, from a staffing perspective, certainly can do one a month.
Okay.
And, be able to function within that. It gives more direction to, potential petitioners that this is the date that the next meeting that you could potentially make this is our deadline to make that meeting for submittal, and then that it's on them to make that meeting.
Based on your statement that if we go to one a month, that we could do a continuance to any day, does that not make that continuance date a special meeting?
So it would be, the public hearing would still be publicized for the first meeting date.
Right.
So if you continue it to another meeting date, it wouldn't require a special meeting because it still is under that first
Oh,
public
my,
notice.
my point being that, isn't there something in our
Behind you.
codes that says if we call a special meeting, the person having that meeting has additional fees and that?
Yeah, there is some provisions in there for, we haven't, for any continuances like that, we have not charged additional fees for those.
No, because we've
But-
continued it to
Correct.
the next regular meeting night.
Right. That would be up to, at our discretion if it's something that we would need to have a special meeting specifically to review that case. We could charge separately for that. But that would be up to our discretion to charge for that.
Okay, so.
But I don't think-
By
by-
definition, then we would not be calling that a special meeting.
Correct, we would, yeah, if we only had the one a month, because under our code, it's, again, the code doesn't specify that our meetings are to be held on the second and fourth Thursday of each month.
Right, yeah.
So any meeting is based off when we establishment. But if we needed to call in a business for a special hearing for how they're currently operating, that could dictate a special meeting. We would charge a fee for that.
Semantics. I guess.
Great, yeah. It's, it's,
We can record, I mean, it would depend on the petitioner. I think we've all found ourselves to be flexible to say maybe 2 weeks is the right time frame. They have to go back and review it, so that may resolve itself in any event. But I think one of the other questions that Mr. Simmons is asking is that past pattern and practice has been, we've always assembled on Thursday. And the question at hand is, does that still work for everybody? Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, does it make a difference? Do you
Better
care?
on Friday.
Not Friday.
I don't recommend Fridays.
Not
Friday,
Saturday.
Saturday.
But, we still,
Thursdays are usually the best for me, just from a traveling perspective, as well as springtime, summertime baseball perspective. We usually don't have games Thursday nights.
one of the things that we have discussed in the past, and I want to be fair to everyone involved, but before we go down that path, Mr. Pippin, were you about to
No.
talk about it?
No, I think Thursday works for me, so it's fine.
The only other comment that I have around this was, our start time, we wanted to be respectful to all members because everyone has jobs. And that was a discussion we had previously, and we discussed it, and we said we'd keep 7:30. But then we talked about earlying it up a little bit. And I don't know if there's any appetite to consider that once again, or we just kind of, 7:30 works, and that's the way we'll keep it.
I thought mainly it was for the guys traveling out from the city that had an opportunity to get here in time.
That's,
What happened to you tonight?
well, I had.
Where would you have been at 7 o'clock?
Well, I could have been here at 7 o'clock. I just would have missed my kid's concert. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and I'm not, recommending any specific time or date, just asking, throwing out there if it's something that, what I'm hearing is the board, you're comfortable with going to once a month, whether you're probably focusing on, I would say, the second Thursday of the month, because then they won't run into Thanksgiving. or
Personally, I would prefer 7 o'clock, and I think the public might prefer 7 o'clock. The village board meets at 6. I wouldn't like that too much.
They're meeting at 6 now?
Yes.
Wow. Jeez.
so I'm very sensitive to this because, basically everybody's volunteering to do this, and I don't want to put anybody in an awkward spot. Do you need a definitive answer tonight, Mr. Simmons, about the time?
No.
And maybe what we can do is take a poll and then come back and review so we don't put anybody in an awkward spot, if that's acceptable to everybody. And we're going to be respectful to everybody, because what I don't want to do is find ourselves saying, this is the time, then someone says, hand up, I'm done. I don't want that to occur either. We don't need that kind of headache. And the reason why I'm bringing that up, gentlemen, is that I am aware that we've made a request once again for an 8th member. Now, the good news is here we are tonight. Everybody's here. Great. But it's been my experience that sometimes we don't have a full panel. And that's another thing that's coming down the pipe. So just wanted you to be aware. Whether or not that gets approved, I have no idea. All right, so how about if we do this, Mr. Simmons? I'm trying to think of the democratic way. I don't think I should be involved in that. Would everybody be comfortable just communicating directly with Mr. Simmons about, I think we've agreed on a day, Thursdays, second Thursday, and then a time, if everybody wouldn't mind just emailing Mr. Simmons with a recommended time, and then when we meet again, we'll discuss the findings and see where it takes us.
Sounds good.
Yeah? Does that work for you, Mr. Simmons?
Yeah, it's fine.
You got my vote.
And mine,
Mine too.
and mine.
With that being said, so moved.
Before we do that, I want to give Mr. Simmons the benefit of the doubt. I want to make sure that was the only other item that he had.
Yeah, that's all I had for discussion. So we will have a meeting in 3 weeks
On the
from today.
14th. At 7:30.
Correct.
Okay. Gentlemen, anything else before we close? All right, the chair will entertain a motion to adjourn our
I
meeting.
already moved.
I'm so moved with it.
You didn't have to entertain it, I already made it.
Well, we weren't finished with the meeting.
Do you need a second?
I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Second.
All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We're gonna
Brad,
call this the
I will
school
be out of
meeting?
town on the 14th.
Okay.